I was interested in working with George Martin again, so I just telephoned him and asked him if he wanted to do it. Not sure about it. But in fact, coming together again was really a great after the Beatles broke up. George Martin, the godfather of the band, the man who turned four boys from Liverpool and their rough demo tapes into living legends, chose to remain silent. For decades, he avoided every question about Paul McCartney. But now, a final autobiographical journal discovered in his quiet wooden cottage in Wiltshire has changed everything. Within its yellowed pages, Martin was no longer the composed producer of Abbey Road, but a bitter witness recounting what he called the dark period, a time filled with love affairs buried under money, dangerous political maneuvering, and even an ambiguous relationship between Paul McCartney and John Lennon that the public never knew existed. What in the end made the man who once loved McCartney like his own son write such words of resentment? Let's find out. 1. Paul and John were closer than any pair of people I've ever known in my life. Closer even than love itself. Those words written in bold ink by George Martin feel as if he wanted to carve them into history. Anyone reading them would stop for a long moment. For more than half a century, the world had only known them as the legendary songwriting duo Lennon-McCartney. Two geniuses who gave us yesterday. All you need is love, let it be. But in Martin's eyes, as someone who had witnessed every night they sat side by side in the studio, that relationship had never been just about music. From 1963 to 1966, John and Paul were practically inseparable. They wrote songs together on the old piano in Studio 2 at Abbey Road, had lunch at the Swiss Café, then drove off into the night in Paul's silver Aston Martin when the clock had long struck midnight. They needed each other like air. Martin wrote, John was fire, Paul was water. When they blended, they created magic. But when they split apart, both became dangerous. No one knew that at the time. John already had a wife, Cynthia Powell, and a young son, Julian, while Paul was dating Jane Asher, one of London's most elegant stars. Yet, according to Martin, all bonds seemed to dissolve when they were together. He recalled, one evening after recording If I Fell in 1964, Martin returned to the studio and caught John and Paul sitting close together, their heads nearly touching, adjusting chords, and quietly laughing. It felt like they were sharing something that went beyond music, he wrote. Cynthia stood in the hallway watching with the look of someone who had just realized she was no longer the center of her husband's world. But what happened afterward left the entire studio in silence. The management began to take notice. Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, feared that this overly intimate relationship could destroy the image of four charming young men adored by millions of female fans. Few knew that in 1965 at the Apple office, Epstein convened a secret meeting. Martin recorded every word. From now on, John and Paul are not to share a room while on tour. They must not sit next to each other in front of cameras, and every private interview must be screened before airing. From that day on, old photos started disappearing. The company chose to cover it up. Martin wrote, there were reels of film cut, lines erased because they were afraid the public might discover that between those two geniuses existed a kind of affection no one dared to define. Journalist Maureen Cleave once said they were two halves of the same brain. But according to Martin, that wasn't a metaphor. John once told me, I can't write unless Paul's beside me. And Paul would always find a way to make John laugh, as if only John's laughter could remind him he was still alive. And then everything changed because of one woman. The 1965 American tour was the turning point in New York. John met Yoko Ono at the Indica Gallery exhibition. From the exchange of art letters to long sleepless nights of conversation, John slowly drifted out of Paul's orbit. At first, Paul remained friendly. He even invited Yoko to the studio to listen to Nowhere Man. But according to Martin, her presence was the first crack in the Lennon-McCartney wall. One night in 1968 during the recording of the White Album, Martin witnessed something he said he would never forget. Yoko sat next to John the entire session, while Paul stood silently in the corner saying nothing. When the session ended, Paul left without saying goodbye to anyone. I knew at that moment the Beatles had begun to fall apart. From then on, Paul became more possessive, more impulsive. Martin recalled, once when John suggested including a song co-written with Yoko on the album, Paul immediately tore it off the list. No one gets between me and John, Paul shouted. Martin wrote, I no longer knew whether that was love or control. But what happened next sent chills through everyone in the studio. A journalist from the Daily Mirror published an article hinting that the Lennon-McCartney relationship had crossed the line of artistry. The piece vanished within a day, erased by EMI's own press team. Yet the rumor spread. No one dared to ask directly, Martin wrote. But everyone knew there was something special between those two men. Martin admitted he never dared speak of it while alive. Even after they were gone, those in power still wanted silence. But in his journal, he left one line that makes readers shiver. Once Paul came to me and quietly asked, "Do you think John still needs me?" I didn't answer because I knew whatever I said would hurt him. Ever since Yoko appeared, John no longer belonged to anyone. In March 1969, John married Yoko in Gibraltar. Paul didn't attend. Instead, Martin found him sitting alone at Abbey Road, playing the first notes of Let It Be. And that was the moment Martin knew. The Beatles had truly ended. After the wedding, John grew increasingly distant while Paul tried to control everything from recording schedules to the band's decisions, as if desperately clinging to the past. He refused to admit that the Beatles had already died in his heart, Martin wrote. And he blamed Yoko, the press, even me, just so he wouldn't have to face the truth. The one he couldn't let go of was John. After pages filled with jealousy and loss between Paul and John, George Martin's journal shifted tone colder, sharper. He wrote, too, when John was gone, Paul began trying to fill that void with women, but his affections never lasted long enough to be honest. That opening line found on page 87 of the journal signaled a dark turning point. George Martin's voice became icy, almost cruel, as if he were stripping away every layer of glamour the world had draped over Paul McCartney for decades. No one knew that even before the Beatles became famous, the image of the gentle musician had been constructed through secret deals and hush money. According to Martin, back in 1961, when the group was still an unknown band playing in Hamburg nightclubs, McCartney became entangled in a scandal that nearly destroyed the Beatles before they ever made it big. The girl in question was Ran, a kind-hearted hairdresser from Liverpool who used to wash Paul's shirts, cook his meals, and believed he would marry her. When Rand became pregnant, McCartney was only 19 with nothing but a handful of rough demo tapes and a dream of becoming a star. He panicked, not because he feared becoming a father, but because he feared losing his chance at fame, Martin wrote.